Late August in Brookhaven, Georgia. The heat still clung to the air even after the sun had set, the kind of humid southern evening where the streets carry the smell of warm asphalt and faint traces of honeysuckle. It was Friday, August 29, 2014, the start of Labor Day weekend. For most people, it meant cookouts, long drives to the lake, or nights out with friends. For Lauren Jade Mitchell, it started with a fight. Lauren was 25, the sort of person who gave off the quiet impression that she had more plans than she ever said out loud. She'd graduated from the University of Georgia with a degree in communications and, for the last year, had been working at a small online design company in Athens. The pay wasn't spectacular, but she liked the creative side of it. In her spare time, she sketched ideas for a streetwear brand, clothes she imagined blending the grit of skate culture with clean, modern lines. That Friday, she had been texting back and forth with her boyfriend, Jason Ward. What began as a disagreement over weekend plans turned into a heated exchange neither of them wanted to have. Jason had been vague about seeing friends in Atlanta, Lauren accused him of not being straightforward, and words that didn't need to be said were said. By late afternoon, the conversation had gone cold. She didn't want to spend the night alone in her apartment. That was when a message popped up from an old high school friend, Marissa Alvarez. "Hey, a few of us are getting together at my place tonight. You should come." Peachtree Commons, you remember it? Lauren remembered. Peachtree Commons was a mixed-use development in Brookhaven, luxury apartments above boutiques, bars, and restaurants. She'd been there a few times but never for a party. Marissa explained it was nothing formal, just a reunion of a few old classmates, maybe some friends of friends. Lauren hesitated for all of 5 minutes before replying, "I'll be there." She showered, put on dark jeans, a cream blouse, and her olive green jacket. The drive from Athens to Brookhaven took just under an hour. She rolled the windows down for part of it, letting the late summer night air fill the car. At 8:45 p.m., she pulled into the underground parking structure of Peachtree Commons, locked her silver Toyota Corolla, and took the elevator up to Marissa's floor. Inside Marissa's apartment, the night started easily enough. About a dozen people were there, some Lauren recognized immediately, others she only vaguely remembered. There was laughter, music low enough not to disturb the neighbors, and a couple of bottles of wine open on the counter. Among the guests was Ethan Cole Ramirez. Lauren didn't know Ethan well. In fact, she wasn't sure they'd ever spoken before. They'd gone to the same high school but in different circles. Ethan was a couple of years older and, according to Marissa, had only been back in town for a few months after working construction jobs out of state. He spent most of the evening on the edge of conversations, drink in hand, eyes moving around the room like he was sizing people up. Lauren noticed at one point that Ethan seemed focused on Chloe Benton, another guest she knew slightly. Chloe was polite but kept her distance. Whatever Ethan had tried to say to her didn't seem to land. A flicker of irritation crossed his face before he turned away. Lauren didn't think much of it at the time. It was just one of those small social tensions you see at any gathering. By 11 p.m., someone suggested they move the night downstairs to one of the bars on the street level. The group headed first to the Green Lantern, a narrow tavern with dim lighting and a long oak bar. Lauren ordered a single gin and tonic, sipping it slowly while catching up with Marissa. They didn't stay long before moving to another place, the Rusty Anchor, a livelier bar with music spilling out onto the sidewalk. Security scanned IDs at the door, and Lauren's bank statement would later show one drink purchased there. She wasn't planning to overdo it. Around midnight, the mood in the group shifted toward winding down. They drifted back upstairs to Marissa's apartment. Lauren settled on the arm of a couch, scrolling through her phone between bits of conversation. At 2:12 a.m., she texted Jason again. "Can you come get me? Can't find my keys." The message went unread. Jason was downtown with friends, his phone somewhere in his jacket pocket. 15 minutes later, Lauren sent another. "Not mad. Just tired. Battery low." She thought about staying the night at Marissa's place. Then, almost an hour later, she found her keys in her jacket pocket. It was the kind of oversight that makes you roll your eyes at yourself. At 3:46 a.m., she sent what would be her last message to Jason. "Sorry. Hope you're okay." Security cameras in the Peachtree Commons complex caught the next sequence of events. At 3:50 a.m., Lauren and Ethan were seen walking side by side through the quiet, empty courtyard toward the parking structure. They weren't speaking much, but there was no visible tension. Street lamps overhead cast long, sharp shadows. They moved at a steady pace, neither rushing nor lingering. 5 minutes later, another camera picked them up at a different section of the lot. Lauren was slightly behind Ethan. A moment later, they walked out of frame, and that was the last time Lauren was seen on camera. At 3:58 a.m., the black Chevrolet Camaro registered to Ethan Ramirez was recorded exiting the complex. Lauren's Toyota remained parked where she had left it. It would stay there for days, unmoved, the driver's seat empty, the keys no longer in her possession. From the outside, it was just another late-night return from a party. Two people walking to their cars. No raised voices, no sudden movements. But in that gap, the few minutes between the last time she appeared on camera and the moment Ethan's car left, something happened. Something that would never be recorded. Lauren didn't show up for work on Monday. Her co-workers in Athens assumed she was taking an extra long weekend. Jason thought she might still be angry and avoiding him. And Marissa, busy with her own plans, didn't immediately notice she hadn't heard from Lauren since the party. It wasn't until Tuesday, 3 days after that walk to the parking lot, that her father, Robert Mitchell, started making calls. Calls that went unanswered. By then, whatever had happened to Lauren Mitchell on that hot August night in Brookhaven was already sealed in silence, somewhere between an apartment elevator and the glow of a parking lot camera. The Tuesday after Labor Day started like any other in Brookhaven. Commuters poured onto Peachtree Road, coffee cups in hand, eyes fixed on the week ahead. In Athens, the small office where Lauren Mitchell worked was buzzing back to life after the long weekend. But there was one empty chair, and it stayed empty. Lauren hadn't called in sick. She hadn't emailed. Her manager tried her cell phone mid-morning, but it went straight to voicemail. It wasn't entirely unusual for someone to take an extra day after a holiday, but Lauren wasn't the type to vanish without a word. By noon, a coworker texted Jason Ward to ask if he'd heard from her. He hadn't. Jason assumed she was still upset from Friday night's argument. He figured she needed space. But that assumption started to fray when he realized he hadn't even seen her online status pop up since the early hours of Saturday morning. Meanwhile, Robert Mitchell, Lauren's father, was trying his own list of numbers. His calls to Lauren's cell went unanswered. So did the ones to Marissa Alvarez, who admitted she hadn't spoken to Lauren since the party. When Robert asked if Lauren had driven home that night, Marissa hesitated. She said she might stay, Marissa explained. But I don't think she actually slept here. That small uncertainty gnawed at Robert. He was a man used to things making sense, an ex-army mechanic who now ran his own repair shop. If a machine stopped working, there was always a cause. People didn't just disappear. By late afternoon Tuesday, Robert made the drive to Brookhaven. The Peachtree Commons complex looked orderly, almost sterile. Clean sidewalks, manicured shrubs, security gates. But when he reached the underground parking garage, he saw it. Lauren's silver Toyota Corolla, parked alone against a concrete pillar, exactly as it would have been if she'd arrived Friday night and never touched it again. The car was locked. Through the window, Robert could see the seats were tidy. No purse. No phone. No overnight bag. He tried the handle anyway, no give. A security guard came by on a routine patrol and listened as Robert explained. The guard agreed to pull footage from the weekend, though he warned that the cameras didn't cover every angle. There's always blind spots, he said, especially between the elevators and certain rows in the lot. Wednesday morning, Robert filed a missing person report with the Brookhaven Police Department. The response was quick. A patrol car met him at the complex, and 2 detectives started taking statements. Marissa told them about the gathering, the move to the bars, the return to her apartment. She mentioned Ethan Ramirez only when asked who had left with Lauren. Yeah, they walked out together, she said. I just figured they were heading to their cars. Detectives noted Ethan's name and paid him a visit that same afternoon. He answered the door wearing a faded t-shirt, his dark hair slightly disheveled. His story was short and, in his words, kind of fuzzy. He admitted he'd been drinking, had smoked marijuana, and had taken an Adderall that night. According to him, he and Lauren walked toward the parking area together but eventually split up. "She went one way, I went the other," he said. "I figured she drove off." The detectives didn't like vague. They also didn't like the visible marks on Ethan's forearms, fresh scrapes, a bruise near his wrist, and something that looked suspiciously like a bite mark on the side of his hand. When asked, Ethan gave shifting explanations. Maybe he'd injured himself working on his car, maybe he'd hit something out of frustration, maybe he'd gotten into a scuffle he couldn't recall clearly. The next request was simple: let them take his Camaro for a look. Ethan refused, saying he needed it for work. That refusal was all they needed to file for a search warrant. 2 days later, investigators rolled Ethan's black Camaro into the police garage. To the naked eye, it looked spotless. Not just clean, detailed. The trunk was bare, the carpets almost new. It was the kind of clean that didn't happen by accident. When forensic techs sprayed luminol, faint glowing patterns appeared on the trunk carpet, along the rubber seals, and inside the lining. Swabs were taken and sent to the lab. At the same time, detectives subpoenaed Ethan's phone records. Location data placed his device in the same vicinity as Lauren's until almost 5 a.m. on Saturday morning. After that, her phone signal went dead. His kept moving. On Friday, the results came back. DNA from both blood and saliva found in Ethan's trunk matched Lauren Mitchell. It wasn't enough to explain exactly what had happened in the parking garage, but it erased the idea that Ethan had simply walked away from Lauren that night. By then, the tone of the investigation had shifted. Lauren was no longer considered a missing adult who might have left on her own. Detectives were now looking at a likely felony, and the man they believed was last with her was at the center of it. This was only the start. The search for Lauren was about to grow beyond Brookhaven, pulling in volunteer teams, news crews, and anyone willing to walk fields and wooded lots under the Georgia sun. But in those first days, all anyone really knew was this. Her car sat exactly where she'd left it. Her phone was silent. And the last person seen with her was driving away in a Camaro, alone. When Brookhaven police pulled the security archives from Peachtree Commons, the detectives already knew what they were hoping to find, and what they feared they wouldn't. The cameras in the complex were modern but limited. Each one covered a slice of hallway, a stretch of parking aisle, an elevator lobby. Together, they created an incomplete mosaic of the building's movements. And like any mosaic, the story they told depended on which pieces were missing. Lauren's story had plenty missing. The earliest relevant clip was at 3:50 a.m. Saturday morning. Lauren and Ethan walking through the open-air courtyard that linked the residential tower to the parking structure. The scene looked ordinary. The two were side by side, their pace steady. They didn't touch, didn't argue, didn't look in any rush. A second camera picked them up 5 minutes later, this time inside the parking garage, passing between 2 rows of cars. Lauren was slightly behind Ethan, her gaze aimed toward the row where her Toyota was parked. Then they crossed into a dark section of the garage, a blind spot where no camera lens could see. And that was it. No footage of Lauren entering her car. No footage of her leaving on foot. No footage of her anywhere after that moment. At 3:58 a.m., an exterior camera caught Ethan's black Camaro easing up the ramp and out into the street. The car's brake lights flared briefly before it disappeared into the night. Lauren's Corolla never moved. The detectives replayed the footage over and over, scanning every corner of every frame, watching background figures, checking timestamps. They found nothing else of Lauren. The conclusion was unavoidable. Whatever happened to her happened in the garage, somewhere in that blind zone. That gap, less than 3 minutes long, would become the heart of the case. On Thursday, investigators returned to Ethan's apartment for a second interview. He answered the door, leaning against the frame, his expression flat. His story didn't change much from before. They walked together, she went one way, he went another, he never saw her again. But when detectives pressed him for specifics, where exactly in the garage they split, how many cars were nearby, whether anyone else was around, he couldn't answer. Or wouldn't. Every detail dissolved into, "I'm not sure," or, "I can't remember." They noted his posture, the way his hands stayed in his hoodie pocket, and the way he seemed to measure each word before speaking. It wasn't the behavior of someone eager to clear up a misunderstanding. Back at the station, the forensic unit was going through the Camaro inch by inch. Under normal light, it was immaculate. Under luminol, it told a different story: irregular patches of glow on the trunk carpet, faint smears along the rubber seal, traces beneath the lining. The swabs were labeled and sent to the state crime lab. While they waited for results, the detectives widened their net. They pulled Ethan's phone records and Lauren's. GPS data showed both phones in the same area until 4:56 a.m., far later than Ethan claimed they'd parted ways. Then, Lauren's phone went dark. Ethan's kept moving, pinging off towers on the edge of Brookhaven before heading toward rural stretches outside the city. It was another gap. This one wasn't measured in feet of concrete, but in hours unaccounted for. By Friday, the lab confirmed what the detectives had suspected. The DNA from the Camaro's trunk matched Lauren Mitchell. Blood and saliva, in quantities and locations that ruled out casual contact or contamination. They didn't yet have a body. They didn't yet have a witness who could place Ethan harming her. But they now had a bridge between the last moment she was seen alive and the last man she was with. The next step wasn't just about finding Lauren. It was about finding enough to hold Ethan Ramirez where he couldn't walk away. By early December, the case had been active for more than 3 months. The search for Lauren Mitchell had stretched far beyond Brookhaven, pulling in volunteer crews from across Georgia. Flyers with her face were taped to storefront windows, pinned to bulletin boards in grocery stores, and stuffed under windshield wipers. Each one carried the same plea: "Have you seen her?" The public knew little about the investigation's progress. Behind closed doors, however, detectives were stacking evidence. Every new layer tightened the frame around one name: Ethan Cole Ramirez. The decision to move on him came on December 13th. Just after dawn, 2 unmarked sedans pulled up outside his apartment. He answered the door in sweatpants, blinking against the cold. The warrant was read out quickly: arrest for aggravated kidnapping. Ethan didn't ask why. He didn't ask for a lawyer, not immediately. He simply stepped back, let the cuffs be fastened, and walked out flanked by 2 officers. Neighbors later told reporters they had barely seen him since the end of summer. Some mentioned odd behavior: hauling large trash bags to the dumpster late at night, coming home at strange hours, once returning with a noticeable limp. At the station, the formal interview began. Ethan sat across from 2 detectives, a bottle of water untouched in front of him. His story hadn't evolved since September. They walked together, she went one way, he went the other, he never saw her again. But now, the detectives had the footage. They had the phone data. And they had the DNA from his trunk. They laid out each piece, one at a time. This is you and Lauren in the courtyard. This is you and Lauren in the garage. This is your car leaving. Her car stayed. This is your phone, moving towards Springfield Ridge while hers went dark. And this, one detective slid the lab report across the table, is her DNA in your trunk. Ethan glanced at the pages but didn't pick them up. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The charge of aggravated kidnapping was filed the same day. Bail was set at $1 million. A figure meant less to keep him in than to signal how seriously the court was treating the case. Without a body, the prosecution was building on circumstantial evidence, but it was strong, layered, and pointed in one direction. In the weeks that followed, investigators combed every location Ethan's phone had pinged in the early hours of August 30th. They searched wooded lots, drainage ditches, and stretches of roadside grass along Hawthorne County's back roads. The winter air made long days harder, but teams of volunteers kept showing up, some of them strangers to Lauren's family, others childhood friends. Sandra Hale, Lauren's mother, was rarely without the small stack of flyers she carried everywhere. She spoke to anyone who would listen: store clerks, truck drivers at gas stations, parents at playgrounds. Her message was simple: we won't stop until we find her. Robert Mitchell took a quieter role. He coordinated with search teams, spoke directly with detectives, and avoided the cameras. But both parents were united in one thing: the belief that Ethan Ramirez knew exactly where their daughter was. By the time the pretrial hearings began, the case had taken on a life of its own in the local press. Commentators debated the strength of the evidence without a body. Some saw it as airtight, others worried it was too reliant on inference. But for the prosecution, the timeline told a clear story. Lauren Mitchell was alive when she walked into that garage with Ethan Ramirez. She was never seen alive again, and traces of her were found inside his car. The trial date was set for September 2016. Until then, Ethan would sit in a cell, silent, as the state prepared to put the entire night of August 29 under a microscope. The trial of State of Georgia versus Ethan Cole Ramirez opened in September 2016 in Hawthorne County Superior Court. By then, Lauren Mitchell had been missing for more than 2 years. Her parents sat side by side in the front row every morning, Sandra gripping a folded tissue in one hand, Robert keeping his eyes fixed on the defense table. There was no body, no crime scene in the traditional sense. The prosecution built its case from what they called a chain of inescapable facts, fragments that, when linked together, told one story. The first link was the surveillance footage. Jurors watched the grainy but clear images of Lauren and Ethan walking through Peachtree Commons in the early morning hours of August 30, 2014. They saw them step into the parking garage. They saw Ethan's Camaro leave. And they saw that Lauren's Toyota didn't move. The second link was the DNA evidence. Forensic experts explained how luminol revealed biological traces in Ethan's trunk, blood, and saliva, and how testing confirmed they belonged to Lauren. The experts were careful, precise, stating that the distribution of the samples was inconsistent with casual contact or accidental transfer. The third link was the phone data. Cell tower logs placed both phones together until just before 5 a.m., when Lauren's signal went dark. Ethan's phone then moved toward rural Hawthorne County, to areas that would later be searched repeatedly. The prosecution called 73 witnesses over the course of the trial: friends, former classmates, forensic specialists, digital analysts. Each painted a portion of the picture: Lauren as a responsible, level-headed woman who wouldn't vanish on her own, Ethan as the last person to see her, whose account of the night was contradicted by multiple forms of evidence. Jurors also heard about Ethan's behavior in the days after Lauren's disappearance. Coworkers testified that he arrived late to work that Saturday morning, limping slightly and complaining of rib pain. Others recalled him appearing unusually irritable and withdrawn. The defense countered by attacking the reliability of the evidence. They argued that without a body, the state could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a kidnapping had occurred. They suggested the DNA could have been transferred indirectly. They floated alternate theories, hinting that Jason Ward, Lauren's boyfriend, might have had a motive, though they offered no physical evidence to support it. In their closing argument, the prosecution reminded the jury of what was not in dispute. Lauren Mitchell was alive when she walked into that parking garage with Ethan Ramirez. She was never seen again. Traces of her were found inside his car. On September 20, 2016, after less than a day of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of aggravated kidnapping. Ethan Ramirez sat motionless as the words were read. Sandra exhaled sharply, tears running down her face. Robert stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. The judge sentenced Ethan to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was final. But for Lauren's family, the verdict didn't close the chapter. They still didn't know where she was. And without that answer, it didn't feel like an ending. In the weeks after the trial, Sandra told a local reporter, "Justice isn't complete until we bring her home." It would take another 18 months, and a discovery in a quiet stretch of land outside Springfield Ridge, before that would happen. The courtroom verdict brought a sense of relief to some, but for Lauren Mitchell's family, it only sharpened the ache. Ethan Ramirez was in prison, but Lauren was still out there, somewhere in Georgia soil, under leaves, in the bend of a creek, or along a forgotten back road. Sandra Hale refused to stop. Just 2 weeks after the sentencing, she stood in the parking lot of a community center in Hawthorne County with a small folding table, a box of flyers, and a thermos of coffee. Volunteers gathered, some she knew, many she didn't. They came with dogs, ATVs, maps, and boots that could handle uneven ground. She thanked each person by name, then sent them out in teams. The search maps were built from one source, Data points from Ethan's phone in the hours after Lauren vanished. Those pings formed a loose trail from Brookhaven to the outskirts of Springfield Ridge. It wasn't a straight line, but the clusters were enough to mark certain areas as high interest. Over the next 2 years, they searched all of them. There were days they waded through waist-high grass, the blades slicing at their arms. Days in the dense pine forests where the air smelled of sap and old rain. Days by shallow creeks where mud clung to their boots and slowed every step. And always the same end, nothing. Timothy Lane, founder of a non-profit search and recovery group, joined the effort in late 2017 after Sandra called him directly. He brought drones equipped with thermal cameras and scent tracking dogs trained to detect human remains. The dogs hit on a few spots, but every time, the follow-up came up empty: an animal burrow, an old trash dump, the remains of deer or raccoons. Robert Mitchell handled the logistics from Athens, speaking to private investigators, ordering satellite imagery, and keeping meticulous notes on every search zone. He wasn't the one in front of cameras, but he was always working behind the scenes. By the end of the 3rd year, the official police involvement had tapered off. The case was closed in the eyes of law enforcement. A conviction had been made. But for Sandra, Robert, and the people who still showed up for weekend searches, it was far from over. The seasons came and went. Summer heat waves, autumn leaves, winter frost. Each new weather cycle threatened to erase whatever trace of Lauren remained. Then came March 7, 2018. A crew of utility workers was laying underground cable along a narrow county road outside Springfield Ridge, a road flanked by overgrown ditches and sparse, leafless trees. One worker spotted something pale jutting from the ground, half hidden by matted grass. At first, he thought it was part of an animal skeleton. Then he saw the shape of teeth. The sheriff's office was called within the hour. Deputies taped off the area, waiting for the forensic team. The remains were in a shallow depression, partially exposed to the elements. There were no clothes, no jewelry, nothing but bone. Dental records confirmed what Sandra already knew the moment the call came. It was Lauren. The medical examiner estimated the remains had been there for more than 3 years. The cause of death could not be determined. The location, just a mile from one of the first zones the volunteers had searched, was remote enough that a body could have lain there unnoticed through countless search efforts. When the lab compared historical location data, it showed Ethan Ramirez's phone had pinged in that exact sector on the morning of August 30, 2014. Sandra and Robert visited the site privately. There was no ceremony, just quiet steps through the grass and a few minutes standing where their daughter's body had been. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The official record now called it a homicide. Ethan's conviction stood. No new trial would be held. For the community, it was closure. For the family, it was simply the end of one kind of searching, and the start of living with answers that still left so much unknown. The recovery site outside Springfield Ridge never made it into the evening news in vivid detail. The sheriff's department released a short statement: remains identified as those of Lauren Mitchell. Investigation closed. Conviction stands. That was it. For most of the public, it was enough. The story had an ending. The missing woman had been found, and the man convicted of her kidnapping was already serving a life sentence. But for those closest to Lauren, it wasn't so clean. Sandra Hale stood at the small memorial marker placed near the roadside. It was a flat, simple plaque, the kind that would be easy to miss unless you knew where to look. She traced the engraved letters with her fingertips: Lauren Jade Mitchell, 1989 to 2014. She remembered every search map, every flyer stapled to utility poles, every unanswered question. The location itself felt like a cruel irony, less than a mile from where volunteers had walked past years earlier, scanning the ground and seeing nothing. Robert Mitchell visited less often. When he did, it was without fanfare. He would stand a few minutes, maybe clear away fallen branches or weeds, then leave without speaking to anyone. He said his piece to Lauren long ago, in his own way. The investigators had no more evidence to present, no further charges to file. The cause of death remained undetermined, a line in the coroner's report that frustrated the family. Ethan Ramirez stayed silent in prison, never making a statement, never filing an appeal. In the years that followed, Sandra kept some of Lauren's belongings in a cedar chest at the foot of her bed: a jacket, a sketchbook full of clothing designs, a coffee mug with a chipped rim. They were small, ordinary things, but they held the weight of a life that should have gone on. When people asked Sandra what justice felt like, she would pause before answering. "Justice is a word people like to use," she'd say. But justice would have been my daughter coming home that night. The marker on the roadside remained. Drivers passed it every day, barely noticing. But for those who knew the story, it was a silent witness to the last chapter, the only physical proof of where Lauren's search had ended. In the quiet of that stretch of Hawthorne County Road, with wind moving through the grass and the faint hum of traffic in the distance, the unanswered questions still lingered. And perhaps they always would.